Hey everybody, it's Rachel Carlton from Orange County High School. I am talking to you today about Machiavelli's book, The Prince. And the reason why the Governor School program wants to focus in on The Prince for second semester is because the theories in his book explain realistically how countries are run and operated by their leaders. And it's going to lead us into a great discussion throughout our units, because as we are diving into modern world history, we've got to talk about how the world got created and how this concept of nation states starts spreading around the world. And so Machiavelli is going to actually give advice to rulers on how they are to keep their power, maintain their power, and to get more power. Before we get into the text itself, let's just talk about who was Machiavelli, right? And the research that I'm about to tell you is from Dr. Johnson of Northwestern University and Dr. Scott from the University of California. So I'm kind of mixing in a little bit of their research. What do we know? We know 500 years ago, on December 10th of 1513, Machiavelli sent a letter to his friend. And in this letter, he's talking about how he got into a little bit of a quarrel or a fight with some local farmers about setting some bird traps for his evening meal. But he also mentions in this letter for the first time how he is writing this book for advice to the Medici family and on how to rule. So it's like he says in this letter, it's like a little piece of work, right? But we know that this little piece of work becomes this huge guideline for future leaders to follow. What also is a little bit shocking in reading this letter too is that he's actually going to write this book or this guideline to the Medici family for their son, Lorenzo, who's going to take over and rule Florence after they had tortured him. 10 months before he writes this letter, they literally took Machiavelli, the Medici family, tied his hands behind his back, strung him up in a prison cell, and repeatedly plunged him to the floor over and over again to try to break him, which he's always took pride in never breaking. But that becomes the question. So why is he, writing this book for people that tortured him? And that's going to be something that we come back to later in this lecture. What else do we know about Machiavelli? We know that he was a statesman, an advisor of foreign policy, and he was in charge of defense for his native city of Florence, where he was born and raised. We know that comes from a wealthy. His dad was a lawyer, and so he comes from a family that's pretty well educated. And we knew that he really believed in the concept of republic, of democracy, and we knew that he didn't want the Medici family, who had actually gotten put in exile and thrown out of Florence for about 14 years, to become monarchs. And he actively worked against them returning to power. And he actually tried plotting against them so they wouldn't take power. And he was able to serve as this role as a diplomat for Florence, where he wanted people to be able to vote and get and to create this concept of a republic. What else do we know about him? Well, people wrote about him. They said he was very good looking. He actually was a ladies' man. Unfortunately, he cheated on his wife a lot. There's a lot of information about that, but he also wrote comedy. People liked him. He's actually most famous for some of his plays, more so than this book, during his time period. Now becomes most famous for this book after. And so he writes this book, The Prince, after he's been kicked out of office, after he's been tortured, and it was rules and guidelines that he himself never followed. So why does he write this book, The Prince? And Dr. Johnson from Northwestern University explains that's the greatest unknown question. Some say that he wanted to empower tyrants, while others say he wanted to list their crimes and expose them to the world, but nobody really knows why he wrote this book. But we do know that he declared purposefully and fearlessly, without any hesitation, he explained to rulers how they are to survive in this world. And he was kind of writing this book for Lorenzo Medici, but it was kind of like a job application for Medici while he was like a prince about to take power. Some people think maybe that's why he wrote the book, is because he was trying to get back in the good graces of the Medici family. And his experience with politics and knowledge may help him become an invaluable advisor, so he wouldn't be killed, but we don't know. And history also doesn't tell us if Lorenzo Medici ever even read the book. We're assuming that he read it, but we don't know. But let me just say, this book becomes the most important book in politics, and it's probably still is for the last 500 years. It confronts what Machiavelli himself will call realism of politics, and it's going to make us come in conflict with politics and our own morals, right, or our own virtues. And so when you today hear the term, wow, he's Machiavellian, it's meaning like he's like a really harsh, evil ruler. So that was actually started by Shakespeare, but so when you hear that term, it's not necessarily a nice term to say about a leader. We also know that The Prince is written after Caesar Borgia's rule, right? And so Borgia was an illegitimate son of Pope Alexander. He was most famous for being evil and cruel. And so The Prince is written based on Borgia's influence and how he ruled and how he was able to take power. And he did it because of his family's name, because his dad was the Pope, right? So he's able to build off his dad's own success, but also because of his ruthlessness. And so that's a big influence of The Prince. And here's a very famous painting of Borgia, of who The Prince is modeled after. So why do you have to read The Prince? Well, Machiavelli's text, The Prince, is basically a doctrine to leaders and how leaders should actually not be moral. The Prince is a manual for those that wish to want to win power or keep power, and he's going to be in direct conflict with his own Christian doctrine that's being preached and mixed in culture throughout Europe. Machiavelli himself is a declared atheist, and he would say that leaders should have not to worry about their Christian values, but they need to worry about their criminal virtue. And what does he mean by that? He means you have to make decisions that is best for the state, even if it's not ethical, even if it's against your ethical decisions. You have to make decisions on what is going to be best for your country or your republic or your principality. And principality literally means if you're a king or queen, right? And in this text, he's going to explain to rulers what they have to do to get their power, maintain their position. If you are born into it through heredity, then you should do this. If you are trying to get it and you're not born into it, then you need to be like Alexander the Great and just kill everybody like he did to Persia. He talks about using cruelty and to be, swift when you do it. Like when you take power, go ahead and just do all the evil acts you can in the first few days, because then after that, everybody will be like, well, at least he's not as bad as he used to be. He warns people about building fortresses around them inside their own country. He says you have to worry more about people in your own country. He tells people Prince's advice about don't listen to people that are flattering you, because if they're just flattering you, they just want to tell you what you want to hear. They're becoming your yes men. And that's dangerous too, because they're only loyal to themselves. So why is this book so important for us? And that's the questions that Machiavelli leaves us when we're reading this text and discussing it with our teachers. He's talking about the concept of whether it's better to be feared than loved. And he's going to say it's definitely better to be feared, right? It's groundbreaking because The Prince is one of the longest pieces of political philosophy of advice to rulers. Before that, rulers were getting, advice from great, Christian leaders and monks about, it's called Mirror for the Princes, where, you want to mirror what you want out of society or Christian virtues. And he's giving you the complete opposite advice. Why else is it so important? because the languages that he used, I mean, he's not holding back any punches. He's literally telling you, don't ignore the reality. Like, this is, if you're going to be a leader, this is what you're going to have to do. And this is the character you have to play, and here's the rules on how to do it. And this is going to lead us into some serious questions in our class, especially as we are learning more about modern history and history that's kind of impacting us today. The prince has this awareness of what it's like to be in politics, but today we have more of a public outcry. We have social media. We're talking about social justice reform, and public outcry. Is huge in America. I mean, you guys were talking about the cancel culture, right? Like, people can be canceled. And so there are things that maybe 500 years ago people may have gotten away with, like state violence, human cost. But the question is today, are we going to allow our rulers or our leaders to follow the same type of guidelines in order to keep power, maintain power? And also today we have conflicts with ideas in the books. Like, we have the United Nations. We have an international court of justice. So when people, can be tried for committing crimes against humanity. It's going to be an interesting discussion for us to look at this text as we go through our semester together. Since World War II, we've had this discussion about the concept of humanity, right? And the U.S. has led that discussion. And so advice like what you see on the screen right here is not maybe something that we will give into any longer. And so, humanity has grown actually more peaceful, but maybe not. Maybe that's the question. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just on the surface that it's more peaceful. And so maybe it is okay to use this text. And that's going to be the decision and discussion that you're going to lead in your classrooms. And we're going to keep coming back to this concept of leadership and rule, and Machiavelli's ideas of justifying power, and whether or not it's something that we would continue on with, or something we're going to demand to change. And so as we get into these discussions, you're going to have to start thinking about human nature. What is human nature? Are you born, ungrateful? Are you, what creates somebody to lie? Like, Machiavelli will tell you, everybody lies, like even in your relationships today, right? Like, some of us lie and say, hey, you might lie to a loved one to tell them something positive about themselves that you may or may not necessarily believe is true. So this is going to be discussions that you're going to have as we go into The Prince throughout the semester. And The Prince has got some major themes that I just want to give you a quick little background as you jump into it. And one of them is the concept of the fox, the lion. He basically says, if you're going to be a prince, then you got to decide what beast you want to be. Do you want to be the fox and be the sly one that traps people and is manipulative and sneaky? Or do you want to be the lion, the vicious one that's just, that everybody's scared of? So there's one big theory and concept. And I'll just put on the screen real quick kind of what the books are about. The chapters in the books are about. And so he gets into these theories. And each different chapter, remember, is going to be about how you get power, how you keep power, how you maintain that power, and advice based on your situation. And so this leaves us, again, to end with, should Machiavelli's ideas still apply to us today? Should we have our leaders do this? Is it okay, for America to justify war? Is it okay for us to use drones? Is it okay for our political leaders to use it to maintain and keep their own power? And these are going to be questions that are going to dive into our own ideas of virtue and morality in conflict with the concept of power. So thanks for holding in there and listening to this. I hope everybody is doing well, and I hope you enjoy The Prince.